to hear. We're about to record. There's a bit of background noise in the main. Hi, welcome everyone. Okay. Hi, my name is Erica George. I'm the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law, and it is my honor to direct the Tanner Humanities Center. I am especially pleased to be able to welcome you to today's work in progress by a valued member of our fellowship community this year. Richard joins us as a PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Utah. We are at the University of Utah. He received his BS in physics from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and did fieldwork before coming to graduate school in conservation biology for 8 years before joining us here. His work has focused on understanding and resolving various conceptual and epistemic issues in the conservation sciences, with the ultimate goal of developing practical recommendations for scientists and practitioners. He is particularly interested in how scientific theories, scientific knowledge, and values interact with one another and are used to justify different attitudes and approaches within conservation. It's been especially wonderful to have Richard with us here this year. He has been in the office, I think, more than any of us. I know he's worked hard on this work. And we had last week an interesting conversation with him about his project and his paper. So the title of his paper, the paper that he'll be presenting today, it's a part of the first chapter of his dissertation. Persistence Through Change is the dissertation, and the chapter is Conserving Evolvability, the Extinction of Species, in parentheticals, persistence. So he may have a different thing on the screen in the room with a PowerPoint slide, I don't know. But he has participated in our workshops. He has participated in offering substantial and interesting comments in all of the conversations that we've had as a group of fellows. And also it's just been wonderful to have among us. So Richard, thank you so very much for joining us, and we look forward to your paper. Our custom is for the virtual audience to be camera off until our Q&A. We will be monitoring the chat for questions, but we're hopeful that you will be able to direct those questions directly to Richard and to the room where he is joined in person by other members of our campus community. So without further ado, Richard, thank you.
There you go. Does that work? Can everyone see that? Everyone on Zoom. I know you guys can see this. All right. So I've tried to make the slideshow as hybrid friendly as possible. So we'll see how it works out. So thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks especially to all the Tanner Fellows. It's been such a great experience engaging with everyone's work. And I'm super grateful for you guys to have engaged with my work. This whole experience has just been immensely valuable to me. So my talk today is called Conserving Evolvability, the Extinction of Species Persistence. And this work is part of my dissertation on the idea of conserving evolvability as a strategy for biological conservation. And so in the dissertation, I'm trying to understand what exactly it means to conserve evolvability in the context of biological conservation. And I'm trying to figure out what a commitment to conserving evolvability as a strategy means for the practice of conservation overall. And I'll start by setting the scene. Hopefully it'll help. Oh, can I change that so it's not covered? Right here. So like I said, I'll just start by setting the scene, which will hopefully help you understand more clearly just what it is I'm talking about. All right, so evolvability is a capacity for biological systems, such as a species, to evolve, and specifically to undergo adaptive biological change. Over the last 50 years, conservation biologists have increasingly endorsed conserving evolvability as a strategy for species conservation in the face of ongoing environmental change. As a capacity aimed at species conservation, conserving evolvability is intended to promote species persistence by facilitating adaptive biological change in novel environments. So my thesis here, I'm going to be arguing today, is why conservation biologists should reaffirm a commitment to the strategy of conserving evolvability, but in doing so, they should abandon species persistence as the strategy's main objective. And to show this, I'm going to show that species persistence is neither suitable nor desirable as a goal for conserving evolvability, while a commitment to conserving evolvability would afford various ethical, biological, and practical benefits for conservation, specifically in the face of ongoing environmental change. And so conservation biologists should reaffirm a commitment to conserving evolvability, but as a more general conservation strategy, as opposed to one aimed solely at species conservation. So my outline for today, I'll begin with some background on species conservation and conserving evolvability. I'll then show how, due to the variable nature of species extinction, conserving evolvability actually promotes rather than prevents species extinction in the long term. And finally, I'll argue why conservation biologists should reaffirm a commitment to conserving evolvability on the basis of its long-term benefits, which, as I'll show, includes species extinction. So species have been the main focus of biological conservation now for over half a century. And the recognition of species as primary objects of conservation was a significant departure for the practice, which had previously focused on the conservation of landscapes and wilderness. Since the release of the first IUCN Red List of Threatened Species in 1964 and the first endangered species legislation in the United States in 1966, most conservation programs have been framed in terms of species and the prevention of species extinction, with extinction risk serving as the main determinant of conservation priority. And even conservation programs that have focused on conserving ecosystems, right? They've still located species as the sources for the kinds of values that we get out of ecosystems, right? So it's still species focused, or still has been species focused. And the value of species as objects of conservation is pretty well established. As a class of entities, species are valued as a fundamental dimension of Earth's biodiversity and as a fundamental feature of our worldly experience. Meanwhile, particular species are valued for a variety of instrumental and non-instrumental reasons. Some species, for instance, are valued for their functional properties as elements in ecosystems, for example, as pollinators, decomposers, or biofilters. Alternatively, some species are valued for their capacity to serve as biological indicators of environmental conditions, such as air quality or water quality. In non-scientific contexts, certain species are valued for their social significance or ties to cultural heritage, for example, as sociocultural symbols, natural resources, or economic goods. Furthermore, some species are valued purely for their aesthetic qualities, such as majesty and charisma. And on many occasions, species' aesthetic qualities have made them pragmatically valuable as marketing tools for conservation, for example, as ambassador or flagship species. And so in Mexico, the Purepecha people see monarch butterflies as the souls of their ancestors coming back to visit. Yet, despite the clear value of species as objects of conservation, the goal of species persistence is apparently at odds with a modern evolutionary view of biology. And the practice of conservation has drawn criticism for its seemingly steadfast commitment to species and their persistence. Critics have argued that the focus on species perpetuates a fixist view of biology, which suggests that species and their valuable properties are things that in principle can be maintained in perpetuity. Meanwhile, from an evolutionary perspective, species are seen as dynamic entities whose existence and properties are ultimately ephemeral. Attempts to defend or explain the species focus in conservation have cited the timescales over which biologically or ecologically significant evolutionary change is thought to occur. Such timescales are generally assumed to be large in comparison to the conventional temporal scope of conservation planning. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that bioecologically significant evolutionary change commonly occurs on so-called contemporary or evolutionary or ecological timescales, rather. That is on the orders of years and decades. In other words, well within the scope of conservation planning. These findings have been partly responsible for a recent surge of interest in conserving evolvability, and they have raised the stakes in the debate over species as objects of conservation. And that's not to say that conservation biologists have ignored evolution, right? It's quite the contrary, as I'll show later on. What I'm suggesting, however, is that the rate at which evolution actually takes place and how common rapid rates of evolution are, those are the sorts of things that have been underappreciated. Now, the idea of conserving evolvability as a strategy for species conservation is not new. As early as the 1970s, conservation biologists advocated for conserving evolvability as a way to increase species' chances of persisting through environmental change. Early views about the nature of evolvability and how to conserve it were grounded in ideas from population evolutionary genetics. These fields called attention to many well-known deleterious effects such as inbreeding depression and disease susceptibility, commonly associated with small populations and low levels of interspecific genetic variation, so genetic variation within species. Accordingly, conservation biologists sought to protect species from such demographic threats by maintaining minimum population sizes and sufficient levels of genetic variation. This integration of ideas from population and evolutionary genetics into conservation biology laid the groundwork for the modern field of conservation genetics, which has since become established as the main scientific framework for conserving evolvability. And so I'll just give you some examples that give an idea of the sorts of views espoused at the time. So this is a pretty seminal paper in 1974, Otto Frankel. Genetics has social responsibilities in two directions. First, to collaborate in planning the biological system of conservation so as to establish the highest possible evolutionary potential. Second, to help in establishing an evolutionary ethic as part of our social ethics, which will make it acceptable and indeed inevitable for civilized man to regard the continuing existence of other species as an integral part of his own existence. This demands continuing evolution. Frankel and Sule, Conservation and Evolution. Why is the capacity to evolve a necessary condition for survival? Environmental change is an inescapable reality. Even if climate were forever frozen in its present state, the biotic environment for all species will continually change. In addition, natural habitats have become fragmented due to the impact of civilization, extinctions, and shifts in community structure and dominance will greatly change the conditions of life for all species. Given these inevitable processes, a conservation program must provide an evolutionary potential. Continue. In contrast to preserving a specific distribution of genotypic and phenotypic variation, a more reasonable goal may be to help ensure the survival and evolutionary capacity of taxa. In that case, the goal is to preserve the dynamical capacity of species to evolve. And some of these assertions have been a little bit stronger and have said something about what conservation is, right? We use the term conservation to denote policies and programs for the long-term retention of natural communities under conditions which provide the potential for continuing evolution, as against preservation, which provides for the maintenance of individuals or groups, but not for their evolutionary change. Long-term conservation, in distinction from the static preservation of species, ecotype or genotype, needs to be conceived as a dynamic process, a process of continuing evolution. And so again, as a species conservation strategy, conserving evolvability aims to promote species persistence, specifically by facilitating adaptive biological change. What adaptive biological change is, it's any species, in the relevant sense here at least, it's any change in a species, population, or individual that affords, excuse me, that affords some survival or reproductive advantage to the individuals that bear it compared to those that don't, right? And this is all with respect to a given environment. So for example, an increase in drought tolerance may constitute adaptive change for a species or a population or an individual in a region facing desertification, right? So this is a desert mallow This is a broadleaf perennial plant that's very well adapted to living in desert drought conditions, right? However, biological change is an extremely broad designation. And for any species in a given environmental scenario, there is a broad range of biological change that could potentially turn out to be adaptive in a given environment. And such change may be genetic, morphological, physiological, or behavioral. So here, this is a desert 5 spot. This is actually in the same family as the mallow species, as the desert mallow. But in this case, this is an annual, so it deals with arid conditions just by being dormant in a seed state, right? And only germinating when there's enough water, right? But beyond this, right, there are other ways that plants might undergo adaptive change in an arid environment. One way is by developing some kind of waxy cuticle layer on their leaves, or by developing spines, right? Just forego leaves altogether. Spines serve to protect the water in the plant tissues from predators, right? Or some weird combination of these. This is an ocotillo. This has these particularly tall branches with really, really tiny leaves, but it also has these thorns to protect, you know, from animals taking its water, right? Now, there are, of course, practical constraints on the amount and type of change a particular species in a given environmental scenario can undergo. These include physiological constraints, such as metabolic rates, demographic constraints, such as population size and density, and other biological constraints, such as the availability of adaptive resources, right? So whether there's enough genetic variation within the species or population available. And yet, while there are such practical constraints, there are no in-principle constraints on the amount or type of change that may be necessary for a species to persist by adaptive change, right? Some environments may be particularly demanding of certain species or populations, and accordingly require particularly extensive biological change for those species or populations to persist in those environments, right? At least ostensibly to persist, right? Now, whether or not those environmental demands can actually be met in such a scenario, the fact that species persistence would ostensibly depend on those species undergoing extensive biological change raises a basic question concerning species ontological boundaries, namely whether there are limits on the amount or type of change a species can undergo while remaining the same species. In other words, can a species undergo an indefinite amount or indeterminate type of biological change and persist as the same species despite that change? Or would certain amounts or types of change render a species lost in some meaningful way? For example, such that it fails to persist in virtue of that change. The answer to this question matters insofar as species themselves, not merely their valuable properties, are the principal targets for persistence under the strategy of conserving evolvability. Whether such limits exist, and if they do, what those limits are, depends on what species are, ontologically speaking, and the corresponding conditions for their persistence. The answer to the question of what species are depends on how species are conceptualized. At least 32 species concepts have been identified in the biological literature. That's a lot, right? So we have things like a topological species concept, biological species concept, et cetera, et cetera. Yet despite this abundance, thanks to some astute philosophers of biology, most contemporary species concepts have been found to reflect shared evolutionary relationships among individuals belonging to the same species, such as being descended from a common ancestor or being part of the same evolutionary lineage. Meanwhile, most of the differences among contemporary species concepts have been attributed to differences in the operational criteria used for species delimitation, such as diagnostic characteristics, rather than to any deep conceptual disagreements. Right, so the difference is how we determine whether something is a species rather than what kind of thing a species is. These observations bear out in modern endorsements of lineage-based species concepts, such as evolutionary and phylogenetic species concepts. And in general, such species concepts describe species as evolutionary cohesive and discrete segments of evolutionary lineages, while they remain agnostic about the processes that serve to maintain particular species, right? So they're evolutionary cohesive insofar as all the individuals belonging to a single species evolve together or they share an evolutionary fate, and they're evolutionary discrete insofar as the evolutionary fate that they share is distinct from the evolutionary fate of other individuals belonging to other species. And here, I'll show how a phylogenetic view of species in particular, which individuates species on the basis of both shared ancestry and shared biological features, offers valuable insight about how species might fail to persist as a result of undergoing adaptive biological change. In an account on the nature of species extinction, Julian Delord identifies 4 modes of extinction for phylogenetic species: demographic extinction, extinction by hybridization, extinction by anagenesis, and extinction by cladogenesis. In this account, each mode of extinction corresponds to a specific phylogenetic scenario in which a species fails to persist and is therefore rendered extinct. Among these 4 modes of extinction, demographic extinction is the most familiar. This occurs when the survival and reproductive capabilities of the individuals of a species fail to meet the demands of a given environment. Unable to meet those demands, all the individuals of the species subsequently die, leaving no descendants. Since no descendants are left, the evolutionary lineage simply ends when the last surviving individual perishes. Some notable examples of demographic extinction in this last century: the Baiji dolphin in China, following the construction of the Three Gorges Dam; golden toad in Costa Rica; the Carolina parakeet. This was the United States' only native parrot species; and of course, the Tasmanian tiger, which is a marsupial predator. I didn't mean to like. Right. However, on a phylogenetic view of species, avoiding demographic extinction does not entail avoiding extinction altogether. Species that avoid demographic extinction may nevertheless go extinct in other ways that neither depend on a failure of individuals to survive and reproduce, nor involve the absolute termination of a lineage. For instance, species can go extinct by hybridizing with other species. In such scenarios, interbreeding among individuals from different species results in the coalescence of multiple species lineages into a single lineage. Since this descendant lineage is phylogenetically distinct from its ancestral lineages, namely to the extent that it is a distinct lineage with distinct mixed bioecological features, it warrants the recognition of a new species. This incipient species may be subsequently maintained by continued interbreeding among individuals from the ancestral species or the onset of breeding among hybrids. Although the emergence of a new species through hybridization does not automatically result in the extinction of the ancestral species, since ancestral individuals may survive and non-hybridizing individuals may persist, the complete replacement of unmixed ancestral individuals by admixed descendants would render the ancestral species extinct. Some examples where extinction by hybridization has been implicated as a main cause of extinction are a couple of fish species in North America: long-jawed cisco and the Amistad gambusia. In addition, species can go extinct by undergoing certain types of evolutionary change, either through anagenesis or cladogenesis. In anagenesis, a new bioecologically significant trait or character emerges in a species through evolution and subsequently replaces the ancestral form in all populations of the species. Though the original evolutionary lineage remains intact, the appearance of the new trait or character distinguishes the new segment of the evolutionary lineage and thus warrants the recognition of a new species. The newly recognized species thus supplants the ancestral species and thereby renders it extinct. So this is hypothesized to be the mode of extinction for a lot of the proto-birds, right, the ancestors of modern birds. This is part of the reason why people say that birds are dinosaurs, because it's been a continuing evolving lineage. Meanwhile, in cladogenesis, also called geographic speciation, a single species lineage splits into multiple following the appearance of one or more novel traits or characters and their subsequent differential spread within the species. In other words, either only a subset of individuals, for example, certain populations or metapopulations, come to bear a particular change, or different subsets come to bear different changes. This may happen, for instance, as a result of geographic isolation among populations and the subsequent accumulation of biological differences between them. This happens in part due to their being exposed to different environmental pressures, having different evolutionary resources available, and being independently subjected to genetic drift. Because the resulting lineages are phylogenetically distinct from the ancestral lineage, they warrant the recognition of new species. As in anagenesis, the newly recognized species supplant the ancestral species and thereby render it extinct. One example of this are Darwin's finches. The species that occur in the Galapagos archipelago are not the species that first arrived there. And so evidently, on a phylogenetic view of species, there are multiple ways species can fail to persist, including by hybridizing with other species and undergoing certain types of evolutionary change. And so it appears that there are limits on the amount and type of change a species can undergo if it is to persist as the same species. This has two important implications here. First, it means that many, indeed most, if not all species are already well on their way to extinction as a direct result of the biological changes they have undergone and continue to undergo in response to recent and ongoing environmental change. These include genetic changes as well as ecologically significant changes in morphology, physiology, and behavior. In some cases, behavioral changes have resulted in increased rates of hybridization among species that have been reproductively isolated from one another for much of their existence. A notable example of this is the recent rise in interbreeding between polar bears and brown bears in the Canadian Arctic. Second, it means that by facilitating adaptive change, conserving evolvability ultimately promotes change that will invariably lead to species extinction, but through hybridization, anagenesis, or cladogenesis. This is, of course, exactly the opposite of what is intended by conserving evolvability as a species conservation strategy. And indeed, if the sole reason to conserve evolvability is to promote species persistence, then it is obvious that the strategy is self-defeating. And so conservation biologists must confront this issue if they wish to remain committed to conserving evolvability. That conserving evolvability ultimately promotes species extinction means conservation biologists have to reassess their commitment to conserving evolvability as a strategy for species conservation. On pains of pursuing a self-defeating strategy, conservation biologists must choose to either uphold the goal of species persistence or commit to conserving evolvability. On the one hand, if conservation biologists choose to uphold the goal of species persistence, then they must abandon the strategy of conserving evolvability. On the other hand, if conservation biologists choose to uphold a commitment to conserving evolvability, then they must do so at the expense of species persistence. The second option would require repurposing the strategy of conserving evolvability for ends other than species conservation. So I consider the first, but ultimately argue for the second option. There are many reasons conservation biologists would want to uphold species persistence as a conservation goal, like the pandas. The most obvious reasons are the myriad values associated with species as objects of conservation. The goal of species persistence provides a straightforward way to acknowledge and deliver on those values. Moreover, considering the demonstrated successes of species-based conservation, a bunch of pandas, abandoning the goal of species persistence might seem imprudent. In addition, there might be a general worry that abandoning the goal of species persistence in this case could precipitate a broader practical shift away from species and species conservation, not unlike what the practice faced in the mid-1960s. And to the extent that most conservation planning, communication, and legislation has been framed in terms of species for the last 50 years, such a broad-scale shift would surely face various logistical, rhetorical, and legislative challenges. But the pandas. Nevertheless, while there are clear reasons why conservation bios would want to uphold the goal of species persistence, doing so would be short-sighted. As I'll show, conserving evolvability has considerable value as a conservation strategy in the face of ongoing environmental change. This value includes ethical, bioecological, and practical benefits, which would otherwise be sacrificed by upholding a commitment to species persistence. One of these benefits of conserving evolvability is that it supports the individual welfare of future organisms, regardless of their taxonomic status. Namely, by facilitating adaptive change in contemporary generations, conserving evolvability potentially affords survival advantages to future individuals in the short term, as well as in the long term, who would inherit such change. Such advantages could serve to limit the suffering of individuals, as well as limit overall deaths associated with shifting environmental pressures, such as starvation deaths due to the loss of a primary food source, or dehydration deaths due to drought. Interestingly, this benefit suggests that different modes of extinction may not be ethically equivalent to one another. In particular, demographic extinction may be an ethically worse outcome than extinction by hybridization, anagenesis, or cladogenesis. Right? Namely, to the extent that demographic extinction potentially involves a great deal of individual suffering. Thus, it may be ethically just to prioritize the prevention of demographic extinction over the prevention of other modes of extinction, and possibly at the risk of them, if doing so would yield an ethically preferable outcome. For instance, in the case of polar bears, it may be ethically preferable for polar bears to go extinct by hybridizing with brown bears than by simply dying out due to starvation, insofar as demographic extinction via starvation would potentially entail a great deal more suffering for polar bears than extinction via hybridization. And conserving evolvability offers a way to enact such a prioritization. So an example of the relevant difference here, right? This seems like an ethically worse outcome than the very rotund grizzly bear polar bear hybrid, right? So the idea here is that by combining biological features from both species, it wouldn't necessarily be able to, to hunt beluga whales like polar bears might, but it might make other more generalist options more available. An additional benefit of conserving evolvability is that it promotes various types of biodiversity beyond species richness and intraspecific variety. Indeed, by facilitating the evolution of novel traits, characters, and collections thereof, conserving evolvability broadly promotes phenetic and genetic diversity, as well as species diversity via the creation of new species. In addition, by helping preserve evolutionary lineages, conserving evolvability also promotes phylogenetic diversity, which draws value from both variety and degree of disparity or evolutionary distinctness among evolutionary histories. As a consequence of promoting various types of biodiversity, conserving evolvability thus provides practical opportunities to focus on conservation targets besides species, such as evolutionary histories and higher order evolutionary entities such as clades. These types of opportunities are valuable for conservation in part because they are not jeopardized by the prospect of adaptive change. So here, this evolutionary history of bears, this is called a cladogram, right? So for example, by preserving these bear lineages, we preserve their evolutionary history. You can see how there's some really faint signals of lines crossing over from other from other regions in the phylogeny, right? So losing an evolutionary lineage means losing the information of their evolutionary past, right? That these kinds of events like potential hybridization in the past might have happened, right? So that's one of the things that might be possible to focus on conserving by conserving evolvability and by maintaining evolutionary lineages. Finally, in the face of ongoing environmental change, the greatest benefit of conserving evolvability is that it does promote extinction through adaptive change. It is now undeniable that future environments will differ from current environments in ecologically significant ways. And according to the latest projections, the IPCC report just came out, the newest one, some of these differences will accrue within decades. Compared to current environments, future environments will present novel assortments of environmental pressures, including novel climates, environmental structures, and biotic interactions. While many of the presently advantageous traits that extant species possess, such as heat and drought tolerance, may continue to be advantageous in the future, the particular suites or collections of traits that are associated with extant species are unlikely to be as advantageous in the future as they might be in the present or might have been in the past. So this is the collectives of traits that are associated with particular species. Consequently, in order to avoid demographic extinction in the near future, not to mention distant future, most species will likely have to undergo at least some amount of adaptive change. Meanwhile, many will likely have to undergo extensive change. For some species, this may involve the evolution of novel traits or characters, while for others, it may involve hybridizing with other species. In all such cases, regardless of the mode of biological change, avoiding demographic extinction through adaptive change will nevertheless require that those species go extinct. By facilitating adaptive change, conserving evolvability could help expedite those extinctions. So I've argued that conservation biologists should reaffirm a commitment to conserving evolvability, but as a more general conservation strategy, as opposed to one aimed at species conservation. As a prospective conservation strategy that embraces and promotes change, conserving evolvability offers various ethical, bioecological, and practical benefits for conservation in the face of ongoing environmental change. Realizing these benefits, however, requires that conservation biologists give up the goal of species persistence. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. There's virtual applause on the virtual screen of the 17 of us who are here. Oh, I'm not on video. Sorry. Hi. Okay. Thank you so much. It is now time for questions. I will field questions from the chat, and those of you who are here with me virtually, please raise your virtual hand or use the chat. I already see we have one. And then Richard, as you'll recall from last week, we will invite you to repeat questions that come from the room. We'll do one from the room, one from the Zoom room, if that works for you. I don't have eyes on what you're seeing in the room, but I'm sure that there's interest in getting involved in the conversation as well. Yeah. So I'd like to first, I see a member of your department, and then I see a colleague I don't know, Tony Smith. Tony, I believe your hand was the first virtual hand that I saw. Please, and welcome, thank you.
Thank you. I'm a former colleague in the department, but I'm back. So Richard, if you could, I mean, maybe if you're there, you could go back to the slide that has the 4 forms of extinction on it. Because I'm sort of curious about why call, anagenesis, cladogenesis, and hybridization forms of extinction, because if you sort of look at the graph, those 3 seem to be radically different from demographic extinction, because there's no sort of offshoot there's no continuation, there's no persistence in demographic extinction, but in the other threes, you get some form of persistence, something keeps going. And so I'm wondering that there seems to be a very big difference between those three with that lack of persistence. And so I'm wondering why call them all forms of extinction when there seems to be that just abrupt end of the one where we don't get the others.
Good. So could everyone hear that? Hear that question? All right. So we'll try to repeat it. So here, one of the things that I'm taking for granted is that what extinction is the loss of the taxon itself. That's of particular interest, right? So as I mentioned, it's not about losing a particular value that's associated with species. It's about losing the taxon, the thing that is attached to the name, right? To the entity of a species, right? So granted, there are differences ultimately in maybe the kind of loss that that a demographic extinction represents compared to extinction by other modes. But it's still not clear why, for the purposes of species conservation, right, why that would be different. Since just the same as the other modes of extinction, it still constitutes a loss of a particular taxon, right? So I don't know if that sufficiently addresses this worry, but
I have follow-ups, but
and I saw Peggy next. Peggy, you can go. You're muted, Peggy.
I think you take one from the people in the room first, Erica.
Okay. I saw Joyce
Go
first.
ahead. I'm happy to wait until somebody from the room.
Okay, I'll take one from the room.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. This was not boring.
I don't even prepare.
Can you repeat it so that we can hear it?
I'll try.
I think I want to ask you about whether your view that we ought to be really thinking about vulnerability here instead of preventing is really like a replacement view or more a sort of supplemental or complicated view. And I think the reason I want to ask this is because it's not clear to me that, what people are trying to stop when they stop demographic extinction is just demographic extinction per se, right, in favor of species persistence, so much as like the wrong kind of demographic extinction, right? So you had this thing up there, species are already on their way to extinction. I mean, look, I'm already on my way to the grave, but I definitely don't want to be murdered, right? So it's clear that, there can be differences between, and it's like extinction of a certain kind of saving that, but also it happening the wrong way. Now, maybe we're going to get too close to sort of ideas of naturalness or, that I know are really fraught in this domain, but it seems, when I think about what people are trying to capture, what moves people, what seems wrong about a lot of the demographic distinctions that we see today, it does seem like we're thinking that there is something, it's not just that it's demographic distinction, right? It's the wrong kind.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I wanted to ask, are we sure that we should, cast what people are trying to stop there as aiming at species persistence as opposed to aiming at the wrong kind of demographic extinction? And if we are supposed to still allow for that kind of prevention, then, is your view going to be one where both these goals are on the table? And if so, is there an ordering among them? Like, is the idea that preventing that kind of the wrong kind of demographic extinction is a good first priority in some cases, but when you can't have that, you ought to switch to conserving evolvability. Or do you want to flip it around and actually have conserving evolvability be like the number one aim when these things are in tension? And anyway, that's my question. It's about whether you're really arguing for, you know, the replacement of traditional species conservation with conserving evolvability, or more like a complexifying of our picture.
Good.
And now, Richard, you have the unenviable task of restating that question.
Yeah, I will try to condense that. And this is going to be a gross mischaracterization, gross abstraction. So generally, the idea is whether it's actually about achieving species persistence or preventing the wrong kind of extinction, right? Something like
Presenting the wrong kind of what?
preventing the wrong kind of extinction. So I take it you're maybe partly referring to something like human caused extinction or something like that, or do you mean something different than that?
I mean, I think, yeah, I think I look at the widespread ecological destruction that we're sort of senselessly making throughout the world. It seems like, you know, we might think that that's bad, and not just in the ethical, the individuals, animals are individually suffering sort of way. I mean, I did notice you hybridized your views a little bit by the move to the ethical considerations, but you know, we don't necessarily have to do that, right? I'm asking if, like, conceptually, aren't there other reasons we could defend, right? That's, I mean, species, demographics.
I'm not sure that I understand the last part of the question. How would it not be if it's about sort of the wrong kind of extinction? It seems like it would be about the ethics of this, right?
Yes, I was trying to say that I wouldn't necessarily restrict ethical considerations to individual animal suffering.
Oh, right.
That was the sort of focus of your ethical considerations, but I was trying to say that doesn't have to be our only kind of ethical consideration. But I'm not individual. I'm not a consequences, so or especially not utilitarian.
No, good.
If we differ on that, then perhaps that's all we
Yeah. I mean, I think that is definitely worth considering. This is something similar that was brought up in the workshop last week. This moral weightiness of human caused extinction specifically, and that's not necessarily having to do with like individual suffering, right? That's about the loss of a species that's associated with these kinds of causes, right? Yeah, so that's something that I haven't developed or explored that far in this project, but I mean, that's something that obviously is worth throwing at, because I think that's an interesting question. And I think that's another sort of important ethical consideration here. But one of the things that I'm trying to show is that it might not solely be about the sort of ethical dimensions here, right? There are these other kinds of benefits, right? The bioecological, the practical benefits, right? So the ethical benefit is one dimension, or the ethical consideration, right? That can be explored more. I'm sure the practical and bioecological benefits can be explored more. So yeah, point taken. I think that's something that could be definitely worked out more. Thanks.
Okay, Peggy.
This question to some degree relates to Tony Smith's question and also perhaps to the one about the ethical question. To what degree do you think, Richard, that the issue is at least partly a linguistic one? So I'm thinking not about what's said among scientists and evolutionary scientists from one to another, but what's said to the general public. So the term extinction, as we all know in the public sphere, has very negative valences, right? We hear catalogs of species that are rendered extinct, and we talk about past massive extinctions, but in general, the effort, as you of course point out, has been to avoid extinctions, when in fact, there are extinctions with no forward evolution, as you've been pointing out, and some that involve adaptation sufficient to make the earlier version extinct. So do you think linguistic change in the public arena would be a good idea that might celebrate adaptive, what you've called extinction, and lament and continue to protest either human caused or naturally occurring terminal extinction? That would require introducing a new public term, but it might make a great difference in the public discussion.
Did everyone
And
hear?
what would that term be? What? I can't hear.
So apparently the people in the room can't hear us in the way that we can't hear them, which makes it very hard for the speaker. So Richard, thank you for your patience in trying to try to translate.
Wow.
We really appreciate it. I mean, it makes it so much harder. So just know that we appreciate it and thank you for it. So maybe the best way to move forward is to distill down to perhaps a sentence or explain what you're responding to. We're still working on what's possible in our technology, but thank you all for attending virtually and actually. And Richard, thank you.
So I'll try to sum up this question. So part of it is asking whether it's a linguistic issue, and in
Partly,
turn,
yeah,
partly. I'll say a couple things here. So I think there's a way to address the problem, sort of to treat it as not having been a linguistic issue. And for this, I'll refer back to those earlier writings on conserving evolvability in conservation biology, where it seems to be, like I mentioned, more of an under appreciation of, for example, the rate at which evolutionary change takes place, and sort of that being a practical consideration for conservation. But to your second point, I do think there's a linguistic dimension here to develop, because one of the things that I'm suggesting by showing that species persistence might not be suitable or desirable as a goal here, right? So the converse of that would be that species extinction isn't necessarily this categorical disvalue, right? So species extinction in cases where there's adaptive change involved might actually be something that's positively desirable for conservation. So I think that might be one sort of way to develop this sort of like, well, how do we understand, right, what extinction ultimately consists in, what it entails as a conservation goal or value or disvalue?
So could you introduce a term like terminal extinction for those cases in which there's no adaptive change or downstream forms, and distinguish that from adaptive? And now you don't want to use the word extinction, I think, in popular parlance anymore, because it's so negatively valenced.
Right.
So the challenge to you would be to consider whether there is any other way of describing adaptive change other than using the term extinction. You could clear up a lot of trouble that way. And by the way, well, I'm on the line here, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you for all those wonderful slides.
Oh, great. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, I think, like I said, that's definitely something that I could look into, the linguistic dimensions of something like extinction, right, in the context of a conservation value. But thanks, Peggy. Drew. Oh.
Thank you for talking. So this might just be my being naive, so call me out if you need to.
I won't.
So one of the things you're suggesting is that in theories, we've got these four types of extinction, phylogenetically speaking, and we're trying to prevent demographic extinction. So we're doing this by protecting all the future species regardless of taxonomic status. So the question I have in promoting these three types, not demographic extinction, is are we actively, so like trees going extinct, it might turn out that a tree here might do better 60 miles north 20 years from now. Are you suggesting that we combine, move, we actually involve ourselves, or we just promote the welfare kind of like nudging the environment? Like at what level are we involved?
Yeah, so that's a question about like how about how this might get implemented, right? So there's still sort of other ways that conservation biologists might intervene in the face of environmental change, right? So one of these might be moving populations to other places, right? So I mean that's just going to depend, I think, up to the whims of the conservation practitioners, or whether it's something that would ultimately require a particular kind of intervention. For example, if there aren't any sorts of opportunities for translocating populations or species, then there might have to be an increased emphasis on something like conserving evolvability in those cases, right? So that's just going to sort of change depending on whatever the particular details of a particular conservation challenge is.
Yeah, maybe I fear it's a little bit of a version of the same question that's been asked several times. But it may be kind of the other end of the question Peggy's asking, do we need new language in the future? I guess I'm kind of concerned about or curious about how we actually think about these different forms of extinction in practice right now, and whether we are actually concerned with in other words, if you told me, as either a public member of the public or a conservation biologist, yes, like polar bears are going to become extinct, but what we're really going to have is like several different kinds of polar bears that have adapted from this polar bear, this polar bear ancestor. We'd probably be like, that's fine. So this is a little bit of a version of this. We might, I mean, are we really concerned with those forms of extinction? It's kind of a form of Tony's question, because we might even not really consider those to be, or like we might not even consider them to be extinct. It seems to me that we are actually concerned with the terminal forms already, but we wouldn't necessarily like it. If you told me that was extinction, I might be surprised to know that it's extinction, but I might not be that concerned about it.
Yeah, of course. So there are conservation programs that deal specifically with trying to prevent extinction by hybridization, right? And these are cases where for whatever reason, for example, the particular genetic characteristics of a particular species or population in an area is, highly valued. And so the idea in these projects is to prevent the introgression or the introduction of non-local genetic materials. So that is one of the pretty well-established concerns for conservation. This is partly me like speculating, but I suspect that part of overlooking extinction by anagenesis or cladogenesis, I think, has been sort of this idea that, well, these kinds of changes occur over a really, really long time, and so they haven't maybe necessarily been appreciated as one of the potential near future ways that species can go extinct. But to the other point, again, the sort of common theme here, I think there are different sorts of ways that to go with this idea of the linguistic and maybe like ethical dimensions of extinction. Like I said, one of the things that I see myself pointing out is that extinction just isn't a categorical disvalue, right? Whether that's the sort of thing that opens up the opportunities to maybe be more precise about particular kinds of extinction, right? Or come up with different sorts of terminology. Like, yeah, that's something that I totally grant, and I'm all for figuring something out. Spencer? Oh, sorry, Erica.
Oh, hi. These are not my questions, and I think it is fair to attribute them, but there are others in the Zoom room. Professor Leslie Francis had a question that she wanted to ask. She stepped away, and I don't think it has been addressed. She asked that you say more about aesthetic arguments, the argument from peacocks, from beauty, all right? Is that salient for you in some way and how you're thinking about this? And then also further to that, she wondered what that might mean for how you were presenting these questions of extinction and conservation. There was a question from the other Leslie, which I'm scrolling to now. Oh, goodness. Okay, because there's been a lot of back and forth on our chat on how we can exist in this new normal and normalize the bumps in the road that we're having with our technology and the flexibility that's needed. So we collectively hope that these transformative mediums as we meet can still be meaningful. So rather than giving up what we've got, appreciating what we've had, okay, so the question about aesthetics. And then the other question pertains to whether there's another way of describing adaptive change other than de-extinction. So I don't know if that's linked to the linguistic conversation you had earlier with Peggy, but first question, aesthetics, what about the beautiful? And then second, other ways of describing adaptive change. Thanks.
Thanks, Erica. So one of the ways that aesthetic values factor in here, that's one of the ways that we appreciate species, right? It's one of the ways that we value species. Well, one of the things that I try to point out at the end was that there are ways that conserving evolvability might serve those values, even though there are species. Extinctions, right? Specifically through the creation of new species or the diversification of existing species and things like that. So the idea here is that, yeah, aesthetics are a value that people associated with extant or currently existing species, but conserving evolvability doesn't sort of take that value away, right? There are still more and future opportunities to value species for their aesthetic qualities. Does that address your worry, Leslie?
I was worried sort of in two directions. One is whether there might be compelling aesthetic arguments for particular species, the peacock, for example, and whether occasionally those might, or whether there might be actually practical tensions from the evolutionary biology perspective. If there were pushes to preserve especially beautiful species, whether that might in practice actually cut against the line you're taking.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so I hope this isn't sort of like a cop-out answer, but I think, in any sorts of these cases, it's always going to be sort of like a bunch of values that someone is going to have to sort out and prioritize some values over others, right? So thinking about, trying to preserve peacocks, maybe maybe like trying to preserve like pugs or something, right? Like pugs have all these like health problems, right? So you have this like these competing values of like people want things that look like pugs, right? Because they look a certain way, but they're also associated with all these health issues, right? So I think for conservation, there are going to be these cases where there are just a bunch of values to be sorted through. Oh, Spencer.
Yeah, so in a sentence, boots on the ground practicality. Does your preference for evolvability over specific species end up preferring the conservation of general species over hyper specialized species?
So there isn't any sort of like obvious bias toward generalist or non-generalist species here. Go ahead.
So the thought is just that a general species has more likelihood of survival and thus adapting to variable environmental conditions than the hyperspecializer, and so would be more likely to evolve, right, than super.
Right. So in cases of like trying to preserve the maximum possible evolvability of a particular species, that doesn't mean that you're pushing that species toward being a generalist. That just means, preserving or maintaining whatever evolutionary capacity is there, right? So the way that this in the working, right, if a particular change turned out to be adaptive in a certain environment, well, you would have, continual selective pressure, which would, maybe refine that change and lead toward like a particular sort of like phenotype down the line, right? So there isn't sort of like this like necessary preference for generalist species versus non-generalist species. I think, yeah, I think I'll just say that I think that addresses that point. Yeah, Danielle.
Thank you so much. I love this. I love the way it's being me to think. I'm not philosopher, but I enjoyed reading the paper and this time I was thinking a lot about humans as species. And I was thinking about environmentalists and so I get into the but I'm thinking about environmentalists who are trying to prevent also the extinction on all of these things that we think ourselves. So I'm just curious, are the conservation biologists at all including humans in their discussions, or is it all about non-human?
Some are. Some are.
Yeah, and then I wonder, like, I wonder if there are ways to think about this in terms of climate adaptation and like human species. Anyway, so that's just kind of
Yeah, so this is, thanks for that comment. This is something that sort of came out in the workshop too. I think one of the sort of takeaways here is sort of like recognizing that there are these sorts of changes that involve humans in the world, right? So things, like increasingly urban environments and the sorts of environmental pressures that might be associated with them. So in that sense, right, there is a sort of like sense of accepting humans' influence and sort of like trying to work with it, right?
I wonder if there's like this implicit right. I want to stick to the not letting species go away perspective because we don't want ourselves to go away.
Yeah, so I'll go back to Katerina's comment during the workshop. Like, she looked straight into my soul. Partly this project is like my trying to cope with like the loss of the Tasmanian tiger, the loss of the Carolina parakeet, right? This is like an emotional thing for me. Like, how do I possibly cope with that? And this is my really poor way of trying to cope with it, is by trying to intellectualize it. Erica, do you have a question?
I have Helga's question. She had to step away, apologized, wishes everyone a happy spring break. Richard, I appreciate the point you made a bit ago, which was now a long time ago, about thinking outside, about trying to think outside of ethics and ethical frameworks. The assumptions of evolutionary conservation do seem to suggest that ethics, ethical frameworks, human constructs, after all, amount to hubris. Would it be too reductive to say this perspective suggests that our humans' ethical commitments are themselves unnatural, contrary to natural logics and grammars, or at least inhibitive or prohibitive thereof?
I'm not totally sure that I get the sort of force of that question here.
Okay. Yeah.
Is that question in the chat somewhere?
It's in the chat. Yeah, that's all I have to it. She also says, there's a part 2. Of course, I know that natural logics and grammars are contraindicated with the question I just asked. And bumping up against language again, perhaps we are, as Peggy noted, in another context. So this is part of this conversation is likely past where that question came up, but in fairness to her, I wanted to pose her question. So there it is. You can take it up later or in future workshops, but
I will take that up. I will read that question over again and
that's that.
Well, thanks, Helga. Question. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. I'm persuaded.
Great, everyone go.
I spent a lot of time, fighting plants in parks, places.
Same.
Fighting plants to help plants. Now I was kind of curious, this is speculative, I guess, but I'm curious in sort of pushing towards the conserving evolvability, especially when it comes to plant management. What do you think might be the implications for basic species management?
Yeah, so in part, this goes back to Danielle's point, to Danielle's comment, to my response to it, that yeah, like part of it is about accepting, right, the fact that humans are moving species all over the world, right? There's nothing that we can do to stop that, and there aren't any sort of places that are free of human influence, right? And part of that influence includes the introduction of different kinds of species. So in one regard, like this is sort of a proposal to work with that, right? But like I said, there's still, in particular cases, going to be a whole lot of values. Maybe, there are going to be reasons to prioritize things like native species in certain conservation programs or projects, right? So again, so that's going to be something that ultimately gets worked out, sort of like a project by project, case by case basis. Any other questions, comments, complaints? Yeah, sure.
I have another question. It's a little bit of a version of Leslie Prince's question, I think, but a kind of bigger one. And I don't know if it's something you tackle or want to tackle, but I guess the question is sort of anthropocentrism or broadly. I mean, it seems like these are all conversations we are having about what we want to hear. That's probably inescapable. These are human conversations about what we will do. But does your framework kind of point to, and maybe even the language is anthropocentric because of imagined sort of volition, but is there a kind of way of trying to do things that the species or ecosystems want that are sort of separate from what we want? And is that just even part of your these are philosophical questions.
So what like ecosystems want, like as like separate from like what we think are valuable in ecosystems?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't know sort of like what sort of attitudes you want to ascribe to ecosystems.
I guess the point would be, I don't want to describe them to them, but I'm wondering if your framework imagines that what species want is to be able to evolve.
I mean, sure, like in the sense of like, yeah, something like evolution, just sort of like, it's sort of like important or essential for like a natural biological system to, to have these evolutionary processes taking place, right? So maybe like in that sort of sense, like insofar as it's like somehow like essential to the sort of thing that ecosystems are, that might be one way, upholding certain kinds of relationships between different species or something like that. That might be one way to capture what you're talking about, maybe.
I have a question.
Yeah, kind of.
Someone who isn't a biologist or a philosopher, they kind of want to take it out of academia and bring it back to current events and pop culture. You have to hear me here.
Let's do it.
I really think the bear that's about to, like, going into people's homes, like, pizza, and I just want to know, how does that kind of fit into what you're.
That's great.
Yeah.
Like that's
It's one of those conversations I felt like it's like a great time to have. Like, how does this fit into, like, these bears, people don't have smaller multiple bears. It's supposed to be, I guess, 300 pounds, it's up to 500 pounds now. This kind of thrives off eating stuff that people, throw away.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ken. That's awesome. Yeah, so I mean, broadly, yeah, like that's one of the ways, like a dietary shift. That's one of the ways that a species might change adaptively, right? And it's even sort of deeper than just sort of like changing your preference, to like, from like seals to pizza, right? There are like really specific sorts of like physiological changes that have to take place, like in terms of like enzymes, whether the animals can digest certain kinds of food, right? So yeah, so the point of that is like, yeah, something like a dietary shift is like one of these, potentially significant changes that this proposal, helps to sort of promote or support, right?
This is a phenomenon here too, because people are trying to stop spirits from going into the homes by building beer traps, and people are writing beer killer on the beer traps. Like they don't want the beers there, but they don't want to harm the beers and stuff like that.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
That kind of mixes with that. It's kind of like a lot of kids about, who can be in the space of beer.
Right.
Also,
No, yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's probably something that's going to be like increasingly more salient, as urban goes into the less urban, and those two environments start to mix more. No, those are great points, kind of things. Yeah, then please.
I learned today from Erica's discussion, and that you were in conservation biology for many years, and then you shifted to humanities and philosophy. And you maybe sort of answered this, that you're kind of trying to grapple with the extinction of the. But like, what else facilitated this shift to say, I don't want to, like, away from the sciences? And I know you're not totally away from the sciences, but what made you want to switch to humanities? What was it enable for you that
It was interesting. It seems fun. I mean, yeah, I don't think that I can point to like one specific thing. I think it's just a whole experience of looking at these problems sort of like multidimensionally, seeing that these problems are sort of like inherently intersectional, right? That sort of thing. Erica? Oh, okay.
I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
Here I was trying to be diligent and watch the. Any other complaints, questions? Right.
Okay, I'm close enough to be able to hear the applause in the room, which means it's time for us on Zoom to also conclude and congratulate Richard for a
Thanks
fascinating
everyone on Zoom
blog,
for
a wonderful
coming.
paper. For those of you who will be with us, happy spring break to everyone. When we come back, we will hear from another one of our graduate student fellows. I heard a voice in the room. Kenna is going to be speaking about her paper. She's with English and rhetoric, and she's done a deep analysis of the rhetoric around something called the Gator incident. So I will just leave you on the edge of your seats with that suspense preview. Please do join us. And again, thank you so much for your support for our fellows and for the center. Have a good break. Have a good day.
Oh, look at that.